This is a mixed faith webinar hosted by Natasha Helfer-Parker and John DeLynn. All participants involved have given their permission to be taped as part of this webinar series.
All right, so welcome to this webinar called How to Fortify Your Mormon Mixed Faith Relationship. And I'm Natasha Helfer-Parker. And just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist. I'm also a certified sex therapist. And I've been working with members of our church pretty much for over 20 years on a variety of topics. The topic of mixed faith families and marriages has definitely been something that's shown up in my clinic a lot more in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years. So it's an area that I really enjoy working with and that John and I have been presenting on for over 10 years now together. So my training is from Brigham Young University in psychology and also marriage and family therapy from Friends University here in Wichita, Kansas. I'm a supervisor, I'm a podcaster, I'm a writer. I do a lot of different things, but this is one of the things that I really enjoy doing along with private practice work as well. John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone, and hi, Natasha. My name is John DeLynn. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. I have been working with couples in faith crisis since the early 2000s, but I pursued a PhD starting in 2009 in clinical and counseling psychology. I completed that in 2015. So for at least a decade or two, I've been working very, very closely with mixed faith couples. I was in a mixed faith couple at one point as well. And this is just the work that I love most. I do coaching, and I mostly coach mixed faith couples in my private practice. And Natasha and I have done dozens and dozens of workshops and retreats together over the years. And so this content comes out of our multi-year collaboration and friendship.
That's right. So welcome to this content, and we hope you find it useful. We hope that you give us lots of feedback at the end for sure. Okay, so a big belief of mine is in order for us to have a valuable time together, we have to right off the bat manage our expectations. Your expectations of what you're going to get out of coming to this webinar and what we're going to offer. And so I want to be very clear about those things from the get-go. So these first 3 slides are actually part of your official training, even though they may feel like a little bit more guideline-y or just kind of telling you how we're going to function and how we're going to do this as a group. Those of you who are going to be listening to the recording won't necessarily be part of this part of it, but what we are going to do with the people who are joining us live is have them all introduce themselves to the group. And we want to be able to do that in a way that everybody feels really safe and respected right from the get-go, because that's so important, especially in this particular topic. We want you to understand that this is not psychotherapy or group therapy by any means. We are presenting basically psychoeducation. So this is an educational kind of consultation type format, which we invite you to participate with us as a group. But that's very different from a therapy model. We also want to be very clear that we are kind of offering general information that falls under social and psychological kind of concepts that both John and I have studied quite a lot. And that means that they're general, that they're not necessarily going to include your particular scenarios. That, each of you who are listening to this have your own unique and individual aspects of this. So it's okay to disagree with us. It's okay for something that we say to not necessarily fit your particular situation. We want to make sure that we're making lots of rooms for the difference between general stuff and stuff that may or may not apply to you. We want to take the approach that we are facilitators and have certain expertise, especially in this idea of faith transitions. But we want to also understand and collaborate with you as the experts of your own lives, the experts of your relationship. And so that's a very different thing. So again, we may have suggestions, we may have strategies, we may have tips, but only you can decide if those are things that you will find helpful to incorporate into your lifestyle or practice together as a couple. So take what's helpful and ignore the rest. That's kind of a mantra I enjoy. We differ in our styles of presentation, and I'll just tell you a little bit about what my presentation style is like. So I'm somewhat loud, I'm energetic, I laugh a lot, I infuse humor. And my humor is usually one of 2 things. Either one, I'm trying to lighten the mood and actually have it be an intervention because sometimes these topics can be painful and tough. Sometimes I laugh or make jokes just when I'm anxious. So that's my anxious response. So I'll try to clue you into what's happening if I use humor. At the same time, I want to make sure that my humor is never seen as a minimizer of your pain or difficulty, that somehow I'm not taking your situation seriously enough. So I just want to be very upfront about that. John, anything you'd say about your style, how you come across?
I don't know.
Am I putting you on the spot?
I tend to be kind of direct and serious. Sometimes I try and joke around, and sometimes my jokes land, and sometimes people don't get my jokes. So I don't know what else to say. You probably can describe me better than I can.
No, I do think you take a very direct approach and a clinical approach. And that's good. And yeah, so our humor may or may not work. So bear with us. That's what we're trying to say. We want to also make sure that you understand that we are not expecting this to be a quick fix or a breakthrough. We never advertise our presentations as, this is the weekend that will change your life, or this is the webinar that will shift everything. We really take the approach that growth and change happens slowly, and it happens with practice. And so most of you, especially when you're facing something as complex as a faith transition of one of you, that's going to take some time. And we like all of the metaphors, even that you find scripturally, about the gardens, and the planting and the sowing. And it takes some time to take some of the things that we're going to be sharing with you and put them into practice and see results. And so be patient with yourselves. Don't expect this to, automatically make everything better. Now, we grew up in the era where we were supposed to claim and be proud of the Mormon heritage. I am a Mormon, right? Type of stuff. So I know that recently there's been some changes with language in the church. We still use the term Mormon throughout our presentations, especially when we're talking about Mormon culture, Mormon traditions, Mormon rituals. So please understand that we are not trying to be offensive or not take seriously kind of the requests of the church to kind of step away from language of Mormonism when we're looking at it from kind of a societal and kind of cultural lens and a psychological lens. It's hard to kind of know what else to call it, because the word Christian is kind of, I think, depicts a very different type of culture, and there's lots of different types of Christians. So anyway, so just to understand that we're not trying to be offensive by using the term Mormon. We hope to keep you all on your toes. So what I mean by that is that we hope to be equal opportunists and making you all feel equally uncomfortable and challenged. So if you're the more believing person, we hope that we sometimes challenge your perspectives and things that you might think. And if you're the non-believing person or the transitioning person, however language you want to use, it's hard to come up with those kinds of labels. We hope to challenge you as well. This is, we're not here to pick sides. We're not here to say that one person, has the better way. This is really about helping you have better relationships. And in order to do that, we need to help you both understand your patterns in your relationship. So along with that, we want to make sure that that's very clear that neither John's nor I agenda in any of this is to have anything to do with faith transition. We are not here to help you stay in the church. We are not here to help you leave the church. We have zero agenda as far as what your relationship with your faith and your religion and your spirituality is about. What our agenda is about is very much your relational and mental health. And how do we help you have good relational and mental health through the process of a faith transition? So we want to be very clear about that. Anything that you'd say about any of those points, John, before we move on?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that the reason why this presentation is necessary is because it's really hard for therapists who have never had a faith crisis to be able to help both members of a couple in a mixed faith marriage. And it's very hard for a therapist that's never been Mormon to understand and to help a couple who's gone through a faith crisis. And even though we want to acknowledge that it's probably scarier for the believer in the couple to be involved in these conversations and in this dialogue, it's probably a little more scary for the believer. And so we want to acknowledge that and sort of congratulate or express our respect for for that position. We also want to make sure you guys understand that even though Natasha and I, have been through a lot and been through different things throughout our lives and in the church, we hold very seriously to our ethical obligation, as you said, Natasha, to not impose our biases or preferences. We feel very comfortable with the value of belief and church affiliation. We just celebrate belief and church participation. For me, and I'm sure it's true for you, Natasha, it's very common when clients come to us in a faith crisis or questioning to encourage faithfulness and full allegiance to the church, because our desire is only that people find happy and joy wherever they are. And I can say to this day, I've never encouraged a client to leave the church or, anything of that matter. So we're very supportive of faith, but we're also very supportive of people's journey. And we just, even though, all of us are on different paths with regard to faith or the church or whatever, we just want to reassure you that our allegiance is to your happiness, your values, and that to us, whether you're in or out, believing or not, we just want to support you and help you guys find the best marriage, the best relationship that you can.
I want to second all of that. And I think it is really important for, like, for example, if you were attending a webinar on this same topic, maybe being given by LDS Family Services, maybe that would be harder for the transitioner to attend, right? And a lot of times as I've worked with people in this regard, these are the worries that people come in with. It's like, if we go to the LDS therapist, the transitioner sometimes feels like there's going to be a bias. If we go to the non-LDS or the transition therapist, is there going to be a bias there? And so right off the gate, it's really hard to find people who you can trust to really take that non-biased perspective. And we're going to do the best we can to offer that. And if we fail at that, if you feel at any certain point that hasn't been the case, I desperately want that feedback, because that is like one of my primary goals in offering these types of workshops. So please let us know that. All right, so moving on, I also think it's really important at the beginning of all of these types of events to consider this idea of self-care, because anytime we're talking about difficult topics, well, this idea of triggers is typically what comes up. And I want to talk about the word trigger from kind of two different perspectives. The word trigger is actually a clinical term for post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's usually, kind of a classic example of that is maybe a returned soldier who, when there's a loud noise, they'll have a physical reaction to that noise. So that we call that a trigger, and we use that as a diagnostic tool for giving people certain diagnoses. Now, in general culture, we're using the word trigger much more often. My kids are using that's a trigger, mom, or you're triggering me. So it's used more to kind of denote discomfort, like you're annoying me, or what you're saying is causing an emotional response in me that I don't like, that I'm uncomfortable with. So that's kind of how it's used more colloquially. So either way, whichever one of those fits, I think it's important for us to be self-aware when something is shared or somebody says something or says something in a certain way where those types of feelings of annoyance or discomfort start coming up for us. So just to understand that terminology, I would like to just kind of make sure that everybody understands that there's no need to apologize for unexpected emotion. So again, if we're talking about something difficult, or maybe some of the interactive times when we ask you to share things, maybe you'll share some emotion, and that is a very normal response. It is not less than, and a big part of what we'll talk about is that we are all emotional creatures, and that emotions are actually very important in giving us very significant clues as to how we're doing. So no need to apologize for that. I want to just kind of give the invitation that whatever shows up is okay. This is really an opportunity to practice non-judgmental mindfulness. So if you're going through this webinar and being either bored or triggered or joyful or annoyed, all of those things can be information for you. And it's okay. There's nothing wrong. You're not doing anything wrong if you have certain things kind of come up throughout this time that we're going to share together. As far as self-care things that you can do, if you notice yourself, especially being in that space of annoyance or distress, you can do a breathing exercise. You can doodle while you're listening to us. You can excuse yourself, go get a drink of water, go to the restroom. You can even go outside and get some fresh air. You can leave the webinar. I would hope that you would come back at some point if that's possible, or share with us maybe, what we could have done better to avoid certain things of discomfort. I would also hope, since most of you, I think, are participating with your partner, is that you would allow your partner to stay engaged in their process with the webinar, that if you need to take a break, that doesn't necessarily mean that your partner has to take a break. So with you, to kind of care for you, that we can self-soothe in some way. So right off the bat, we're kind of creating this kind of contract, hopefully, where we can manage our own stuff. And if I need to take a break, that doesn't mean that you have to. So I would hope that we could make some type of contract in that regard with one another. Any thoughts about self-care, John?
No, you covered it.
Okay. The nice thing about breathing is that 10 deep breaths helps us physiologically relax. And you can do that pretty privately. So that's a nice technique. All right. So ground rules and guidelines, especially when thinking about because the next step we're going to do is we're going to open it up for introductions. So some things that I want you to really consider is obviously confidentiality, to make sure that people who are participating in the webinar in an active way, that we're not sharing with other people. Oh, you'll never know. You'll never guess who I saw at our webinar. Things like that. You don't know who knows who, and we want to make sure we trust each other with our confidences. Do not share, kind of recordings outside of our settings. These are meant really for the participants who've paid for them, etc. I want you to consider this idea about participating. Now, participating in a webinar is a little bit different than if we were in a workshop together, but feel free to use the chat button and ask questions along the way. The more that we hear from you, the more we can connect to you, and the more you can feel like this is part of your process as well. We really John talks about this a lot, the step in and back up approach. So some of us are more extroverted than others. So we might have 500 questions and take up a lot of the time. So be cognizant of how many comments or questions you're asking versus allowing other people to have time. And if you're an introvert, a lot of times we really miss out when we don't hear from you, some of your thoughts and questions and feedback. So, if you could step in and share something that may be, your perspective, that we can really learn from you. So just be mindful about that type of balance. We really want to speak respectfully from the get-go, keeping in mind the many spectrums of belief. And, in this particular webinar, we have 6 people participating, and I'm guessing, I don't know yet because I haven't talked to any of you personally yet, that there's going to be a spectrum of belief, of activity. Some of you may still be attending church, some of you may not, some of you may consider yourselves true blue believers, some of you may consider yourselves agnostic or atheist, some of you may consider yourself somewhere in the middle of those kinds of labels. So a really great way that we can do this is to use a simple strategy, which we call it the for me strategy. So when you introduce yourself, you can say, well, for me, the church is a place where I feel really safe and spiritual, and I have a lot of wonderful experiences that help me feel aligned to Heavenly Parents. That's a very legitimate thing to feel and experience to have. And somebody else could say, well, for me, church is a reminder of a lot of feelings of betrayal and pain and sadness, and I don't feel like it's a healthy place for me to go. Those are very legitimate experiences on very opposite ends of the spectrum, and we want to create a space here where we practice being able to share those things. And it's very different. If you leave the for me out, it feels very different. If you say, well, church is an unhealthy place, if you say church is a place where people can have wonderful spiritual experiences, all of a sudden that feels very impositional and imposes things upon people that they may or may not agree with. So the for me is kind of like this little magical little precursor that helps people share their experiences without imposing them on another person. And then those of us who are listening can be empathic about that without it necessarily meaning that that's something we have to agree with. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We are really big fans of avoiding provocative language. And what we mean by provocative language is kind of name calling. And we use a lot of kind of words that those on the other side are not appreciative of. So, for people who've left, oftentimes we're talking about them like they're apostates, or they've lost their way, or they're being influenced by an evil entity. Sometimes those who have left are, talking about the people who stay behind as brainwashed or part of a cult. These are words that denote non-control. They're words that denote that somehow we don't have a brain and we're being influenced by some other entity. And most of us don't like thinking that way about ourselves. So most of us are like, that's really disrespectful. So it's how we often feel most offended or misunderstood. So we're really going to watch our language and not be name callers in our process together. We want to promote resilience. So that means that if somebody maybe makes a mistake in these kinds of ways, we are going to practice, staying present. If somebody doesn't use the for me approach, or if somebody uses a word that you found offensive, or if they talk about a concept in a way that you didn't think was very well done, we're going to practice the yes and, like, yes, that really is bothersome to me. Yes, I found that disrespectful. And I think this person is, trying to share perspectives in ways that they're learning how to do that better. And I can't expect them to be perfect about, right away. We're all in this together kind of a thing. So although we want to create safety, we don't need it to be 100% safe. We can be resilient too, if that makes sense. This other thing that I really talk about is checking our missionary DNA. This is kind of where I tease all of us. I think any of us who came from a Mormon background, whether converts or we were born into the church, we talk a lot about missionary work, as Mormons. And we really feel passionate about this idea of, if you have something that's really worthwhile, you want to share it with somebody else. Well, this happens for Mormons who are believers. But guess what? This also happens for people who leave Mormonism and now they want to share and, convert on the other spectrum of that. So we really want to help you as we interact together to check that our agenda isn't to convince other people that our way is the right way, that we're really just here to be curious and to talk and to understand each other's perspectives. So check your missionary DNA is kind of a funny way I talk about that. We also would appreciate if you don't use us as a club back home. In other words, so it's interesting to me how people might come back and say, well, but you said this, and so, all of a sudden the things that I said or how you perceived what I said are being used in ways that are not that helpful at home, that are used in either shaming ways or, somehow, but Natasha and John said, and you're doing it all wrong, kind of a stuff. So we don't want you to use us in that way. It can be great to talk about things that we've brought up that maybe not in that particular way. And we want you to remember a lot of self-compassion. So no shitting on yourself, no shitting on your partner, because we're, again, all kind of practicing. All right, so that's a lot. John?
You got it. You covered that.
Fill in the blanks anywhere?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Well, you do this a lot in our workshops, so I guess I did it here for you. How about that? All right. So having said all that, we are now going to turn on the videos, and we're going to ask each of you to just kind of answer these 6 questions. And, we're going to try to keep it to about 3 or 4 minutes a person, no longer than that, or even 2 or 3 minutes a person. So just kind of a quick few sentences, and you can look through these. I know we didn't really prepare you for this, but we want to know just some basics: your name, your relationship status, you have kids, where you're from, where you're living. How would you describe yourself relative to Mormonism? So what label would you be comfortable with? What has been a particular challenge about the faith transition that you're experiencing, either personally or through your spouse? And what is one thing that you're hoping to get from, spending some hours with John and I? Any volunteers to go first? Usually we're all sitting around in a circle, and whoever's closest to me just kind of has to go first. Raise your hand, Dory.
Yeah. That wins.
All right.
That wins.
Go for it.
Okay, so I'm Dory. And this is my husband. We're married. We have 6 kids. We live in Utah. We live in Utah County of Utah. And
Kids ages 10 to 22.
oh yeah. Yep. So our kids 11 to 22.
11 to 22.
All right.
And I'm active and you are?
Non-believer is what I'll call myself.
Okay.
And my particular challenge about the faith transition has probably just been trying to figure out the new dynamics with our family, because we still have 4 children at home. And so we're trying to figure out the dynamics of how this works. And everyone's on the same page, so that helps. There's no secrets. And then I think for me, one thing I'm hoping to gain from this is just a transition for all of us, because we're all transitioning, helping my kids work through this as well. So what are your thoughts?
Not sure. I honestly hope to just learn how to talk better with my wife. Sometimes I'm angry, a lot. I'm angry. I think it's gotten better in the last while, but just try to deal with being respectful, I guess.
Okay.
Just get along better. Any coaching, I'm sitting here just looking at the rules of engagement that we just went through, and I'm like, these are great rules. For me, that's fantastic. When you start calling somebody a name, you've definitely lost already. It's good stuff.
Right. And where was the flipping manual for all this, right? Because I already did 500 of these things that they're telling us not to do.
Yeah, the other thing my wife just brought up that's true, I panic a lot about, there are so many relationships that go through this that they don't make it. And I don't want to be there. I love my wife dearly, and I know this is super hard on her. It's super hard on me. It has not been easy. It was not easy. And I hope and pray that we make it.
Okay.
About me, I do still believe in God. A lot of people don't. I still do, very much so.
Okay. Thank you. Dory, Jonathan, thank you. That was wonderful. We actually clap for vulnerability in our workshop. Yay! I know we don't come from a clapping culture. We're always very reverent. But this takes a lot of courage, and a lot of, just sharing can be really hard, especially going first. So thank you so much for that. All right. Who wants to go next?
We'll go next.
All right. Danielle and Elijah.
Okay. So I'm Danielle, and
I'm Elijah.
Elijah. I'm the non-believer. We have 3 kids, 15, 12, and 7, 2 boys and a girl. I'm a convert. I joined when I was 19, and I am atheist, agnostic, more atheist, anyway, sort of agnostic. I started my transition with Sam Young, and I just started questioning everything and started listening to John's podcasts, and just sort of delved into everything that I kind of pushed back, all the questions I had. My parents, one of the main questions I had was, when my parents got divorced as a young kid, sort of where my mom never remarried, sort of where my mom's, if I was ever going to be connected with my mom again. And that question was never really answered. Nobody could really answer that for me. It would all work out in the end. So that was one of those that sort of always kept on my mind. And, all those, it'll all work out in the end. It'll all work out in the end. And just, I never got some answers to some hard questions I had.
What in particular about, so you're sharing some of the reasons and some of the things that led you maybe to a faith transition. What in particular has been difficult relationally with in your marriage about a faith transition?
Everything.
For me, there's 3 main things that are hard for me. Juggling how to respect her changes and wants and needs, and letting her have her agency without feeling like my agency is being subversed,
Mm-hmm.
taken over by her, feeling like I get the brunt of
We're going
anger
right
of the
into it.
church.
The brunt of what? I'm sorry.
The brunt of the anger towards
Oh, mm-hmm.
the transition of, and
so
then
her anger being projected onto you, you mean?
mhm.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And then feeling like this thing that I thought was going to last forever is quickly slipping away.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm hoping to get out of it is that I can figure out how to relate to her better and come to some agreement or compromise and have this last, this marriage.
I think we had an idea of what this marriage was going to be, and 19 years later, or 18 years later, it's something completely different.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Danielle and Elijah. Thank you. Right. So first of all, I think you all did a really great job of sharing like how hard this is. Like this is really hard. So thank you for just pointing out that we're all feeling kind of crummy. So that's a good place to start. And there's good reason for that. So I think all of you mentioned either hostility or anger as part of this journey, right? And all of you mentioned fear about where are we going to end up? Can we still be compatible? Some of you mentioned your kids and fears there. So super, super vulnerable, super, super real. And thank you for that. I think hopefully you're getting at least the idea from listening to other people that you're not the only ones in the boat. Is that fair? Is it helpful to hear other people having some of the same things that you're having? Like you don't feel so weird or alone. Is that a helpful thing?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Any thoughts from you, John, just from the get-go as far as what we're starting out with?
Yeah, it's just how sacred and sensitive and challenging this is. I just feel for everyone in their pain and their discomfort. I think everybody's right. There's nothing I heard that was wrong. I mean, there's opinions and there's, everyone's got their own point of view, but I think what's hard is that everybody from their perspective has a legitimate perspective. And that's what makes this so tricky and painful. And so I'm just sitting with you guys in the discomfort and acknowledging how hard it is and expressing my wishes that it could be different and my sadness that things are so hard.
And I want to also just kind of right off the bat say, I don't know how you go through this process without having made what we might consider mistakes. I think Jonathan said himself, like, oh yeah, I've done some of those things, right? Or have like some of these, like, yeah, again, there's really no manual. We have a manual in the church for everything except for faith transitions and how to do them well. And so I hope that we can start this process, at least from this space of, okay, we probably did the best we knew how to do. And we probably messed it up in a lot of ways. And at least we're here together, prioritizing this time and this money and this energy to try to do something different. And we're doing that because we really do care about each other, our system, our kids, our marriage. If we can start from that kind of positive space, that might be a helpful space to just kind of look at your partner and say, well, we might have a lot of stuff here, but thanks for being here with me tonight. Thanks for participating in this with me. I think is a good place to start. So offer that to each other. All right, so we're going to move on to the next part. So John, why don't you take away their videos really fast?
All right.
Your lovely faces. I actually really like looking at you. Again, our agenda is going to be threefold, and I'm not sure we're going to get through everything we want to cover tonight. So it might not be as neat as in 3 nights. Tonight, we're going to talk a lot about kind of basic things that are happening during a faith transition that you should probably be aware of, okay, both from an individual perspective and a relational perspective. We want to talk about communication strategies and ways that you can really have conversations in more effective ways. And then the third part of this is really the parenting aspect. So now what do we do with the kids? How do we talk to the kids? How do we negotiate around issues with the kids? So that's our threefold agenda for this whole webinar, which we're thinking will be 3 nights, possibly 4. We'll see how it goes. So we're hoping that you're flexible and can join us. And again, if you can't join us on a Tuesday night, we are going to make these recordings available so you'll at least have the content that you can go over together. All right, so moving on. Why is it important to understand faith transitions? Well, because I think the more that we understand the psychological and social aspects of this, the less we're able to play the blame game, which is very easy to fall into. We want to be able to avoid meaning ruts. And what I mean by meaning ruts is that oftentimes when something happens, a very human thing to do is we want an explanation for what's happened. So we come up with sometimes explanations that are not really based in a lot of evidence, but that make sense. And so we want to avoid some of the assumptions or meanings that we attribute to things that maybe are not accurate. We want to avoid false information. We want to build empathy for what the other person might be going through. Because again, if you're the believer, you understand that very well. If you're the transitioner, you understand that very well. It's sometimes more difficult to understand the other perspective. And we also want to normalize your experience. We want you to not feel like you're going crazy. We want you to understand, as you've done through these introductions, that many people are in your same shoes. This is not uncommon. And right off the bat, since several of you mentioned fears about your marriage, we want to infuse hope, because there are many, many wonderful marriages that figure out a faith transition very well, and that actually can increase some of the levels of intimacy and communication. And, you know, it doesn't have to be the classic, oh, this is going to drive a wedge between us and we're doomed, you know, type of idea. So we want to help you do that. So just keep this slide in mind as to why we're going to talk about the next few things. So the first thing that we want to talk about, believe it or not, this is not really a Mormon problem. So what this is this is an ideas problem. And although I don't want to minimize the fact that Mormonism has its own unique kind of issues around faith transition, but by no means are Catholics, Jewish people, non-religious people, different politics, all kinds of ways that people start off maybe in a similar space. And if you think that you're going to spend 10, 20, 30, these days you might spend 50 or 60 years together with somebody with how life expectancy is going, yeah, things will more than likely change, because we are people who are continually in flux. So this is not necessarily just about Mormonism. It's hard to remember that, though, when it feels very Mormon and when it's affecting your entire Mormon lifestyle. So be thinking about how the following slides impact your particular Mormon problem. So the first thing I want to talk about is identity. All of us have this kind of developmental process of building our identity. Who am I? What am I about? Why am I here? What's the purpose of life? All the kind of existential questions. What do I want to do with my life? And this can be everything from family roles to careers to a variety of ways that we consider this question of who am I as an individual. And what we know about how identity development forms is that there's lots of stuff that go into that. It's not just, this very cognizant, aware process. A lot of that is fueled by things like your biology, your genetics, your temperament. They kind of study temperaments in babies. Certain babies tend to be grumpier than other babies. Things that happen that are not necessarily in a lot of like our cognizant control, but that go into this concept of forming our identity. And another big part of this is our environment. So where we're born, what culture we're born into, what race, what religion, what kind of family dynamics. There's even within the concept of one religion, I'm sure you can think of lots of different types of Mormon families where there might be more, I kind of call it the classic, are you the Coke product drinking family in Mormonism, or are you the not Coke drinking family in Mormonism, right? That's just one way that Mormons present very differently. Are you the type of family that, stays dressed up on sacrament day and all through Sunday, or are you the kind of family that watches the Super Bowl on Sunday, right? And that's okay. So even in Mormonism, there's a lot of environmental factors where the way we Mormon is very different from one another. So I just think that it's important to think about yourself and your partner from this idea of how has Mormonism infiltrated their identity? How did they come into a Mormon identity to begin with? What types of family backgrounds do we have? Mentioned pioneer heritage. Danielle mentioned convert. Some of us have been missionaries. Be thinking about how your Mormonism is tied to your identity and also to your partner's identity. John, what would you like to say about this particular part?
Yeah, what's so interesting about this is that in so many instances, Mormonism was just inextricably interwoven into both people's identity. And it's often common in a couple where it was the one who believed more and who was more devout and who was more hardcore and more orthodox ends up being the one who ends up leaving. And so I imagine that this is an opportunity for both members of the couple to actually really understand each other, because more often than not, both have worn the Orthodox shoes.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is interesting is just depending on the background of your Mormonism can have kind of an effect on how the pendulum swing, how far the pendulum is going to go. So this is not necessarily backed up by hardcore research, but people who took their religion very seriously can sometimes pendulum swing to take their transition very seriously, whereas people who are maybe more flexible in their religion, they don't pendulum swing quite as much. So that's another thing to kind of be thinking about. So just be thinking about yourself and your partner from this particular perspective. The other thing that I think is really important is that in order for, especially when we're little and we're going through development, we have to trust and believe other entities. Now, here in the United States, we have a lot of value placed on individuality. Become independent, be your own person, cowboy up, these kinds of things. And we like to think that we're independent of, that I've come up with all of my brilliant ideas on my own. And what we really kind of miss on the boat sometimes is that you can't survive from a very early age without trusting the authority figures in your life. And so a lot of times those who are transitioning can feel a lot of resentment for the fact that there was authority in their life that now maybe they no longer feel comfortable with. But what I want to just encourage everybody to think about is it doesn't matter what religion or culture you would have been brought up in, this would have been a factor where you would have had to rely on other sources of authority for your development, for your ideas. And the other thing that I want to just introduce here is that some of our personalities, some are more trusting than others, just kind of we lean in that direction a little bit more. And some of us are a little less trusting, just again, in personality. So depending on how you lean might also be part of what's happening. So kind of this trust, believe part of us versus our independent streak. We all have both, but we may lean a different way. And so when you think about this from the concept of faith transition, how do you see yourself? How do you see your partner? How are you similar or different to one another in this particular way? Again, John, any thoughts about?
No, that's good.
Okay. Yeah, because I think sometimes it's easy to say, well, if I just wouldn't have been born Mormon or whatever, it would have been so different. But, I work a lot with couples here in evangelical Kansas and Catholic Kansas, and it's a lot of the same kind of processes, right? All right. The other thing that is very normal about people in general is that we all avoid pain and we all seek safety or pleasure. So when you're looking at the concepts of faith transitions and church attendance and belief, this is also another helpful lens to just look at yourselves through. So if you're having painful experiences at church, or if it's not, really jiving with your sense of self, that's going to create certain results. Whereas if you're having safe kind of experiences at church, where it's, causing pleasure or causing comfort, then it's going to be an entity where you feel comfortable at. And again, some of us are wired to be a little bit more comfortable with pain and discomfort than others of us. And some of this can even have something to do with any type of chronic issues in our childhood. So anytime you've had any type of childhood trauma, probably your resilience to pain is going to be a little bit less because you've had to deal with so much of it. Be thinking about it from that perspective as well, is that, we're wanting to move away from, oh, is this just your fault or my fault? There's lots of factors just about being humans that are taking a role in this faith transition process. Any thoughts there? Okay. Questions and doubts are a completely normal part of many developmental stages in life, starting with little kids to, teenagerhood, to young adulthood, to certain decades as we grow up. And, even in Mormonism, we talk about questions and doubts in lots of different interesting ways, depending on who the speaker was and what time frame in Mormonism. And we've had some interesting talks about questions and doubts. And sometimes they're, thought about as positive things. Sometimes they're considered scary things. It's interesting that we come from a religion where, the original founder started in a space of question and doubt, and we honor his experience in that. When we think about Joseph Smith, we start with that, honoring those questions he had, those doubts he had, and he was thinking through things. And then, it also creates questions and doubts, also creates ambiguity and also the unknown. And those are uncomfortable concepts, right? And so even though I think in Mormonism, we have a great heritage about questioning, asking, praying, coming up with your own ideas, at the same time, we also don't have a lot of leeway or comfort when people come up with answers that don't necessarily fit the narrative. So right away, there's kind of like a tension that's happening with this normal human thing, which is, am I on the right path? Am I thinking about this correctly? Are these answers sufficient? These are normal parts of being a human. And yet what the answers that come to us may or may not be accepted by the general people around you, right? So any thoughts about that?
No, yeah,
Okay.
it's really, I like what you're saying, that Mormonism started with questions and doubts, and I think we all agree that, and Mormonism has a really strong emphasis on intelligence and truth and honesty and knowledge and record keeping. And that's one of the big difficulties or ironies or paradoxes of this journey for so many is, everyone's going to say they value truth. Everyone's going to say they value questions. Everyone's going to say probably that they valued doubt, but how it plays out and how people go about questioning or go about doubting, or, where confirmation biases often come into play, can take people in very different directions. And so this is very true. And it's very complicated.
And it's complicated because, I think in all of your cases, for example, you started out, at least at the origin of your relationship, kind of on the same page about how you had figured out your questions or doubts up to that point. And so you kind of created a contract and an idea and some expectations about how life would go. And then things have changed from that original space. And so that's where questions and doubts can interrupt that process of feeling close to one another. And we can almost blame the questioning or doubting process, like we shouldn't do that because it's causing this now distress between us. And what I'm trying to introduce here is that questioning and doubting are actually very normal human processes. They're going to happen regardless. So let's not blame that process. Let's think about what we're going to do with the results of something that's a very normal human behavior. So, and this is normal with your kids too, right? Your kids will be going through a lot of these processes too. So we want to have good skills to be able to deal with this, regardless of whether it's our spouse or our kids or friends, family who are going through these processes. I also want to just note that certain developmental stages in life are very normal times to kind of re-engage your ideas about your faith, your belief systems, your values. It starts very early at, age 2, when you learn how to say the word no. That is a wonderful time to start thinking about your values and the things you want and don't want in your life. And you get to push against authority for the first time. But, whether it's at 12 or 16 or 21, whether it's when you're getting married, when you're starting to be parents, empty nesting, retirement, each significant space in life kind of introduces time frames when we kind of, again, lean towards reconsidering how we're going about things. So those are all normal time frames to, again, think about things possibly the same way as we've always thought about them, and it reinforces those things, or they can be times when we also change and shift. So as you think about your own relationship together, be thinking about what developmental stage are we in? How does that play into what we're going through and some of our fears and concerns about where we go from here? Something else that's very human nature is
And
that
Natasha, can I just add one quick thing? I'm sorry, I should have jumped in.
Yes, please.
Something, when we're in an Orthodox mindset in Mormonism, which all of us have been at one point or another, we aren't really familiar with what psychologists and philosophers and others write, because we're just so focused on living our lives, career and family and church. But when you are able to peek outside of kind of Mormon orthodoxy and even Mormonism, you will find writers like James Fowler and Richard Rohr and many, many others who, within the traditions of classic developmental psychology, have well documented that faith often has stages, and usually faith starts out through obedience to parents that brought us up in the faith, and faith can often be very literalistic or simplistic even into adulthood. But most people are going to go through faith development at one point or another, and that can often mean losing faith or questioning faith or transforming faith into something stronger. And this is something that's, like you said at the beginning of this presentation, it's not in any way a Mormon thing. This is just a universal thing. And all over the world right now, we're seeing Jehovah's Witnesses and evangelical Christians and Catholics and Muslims and, pick your religion. You've got people on this track, and it's not just something that necessarily shouldn't be feared. It can be a wonderful opportunity for maturity and growth, but it just feels scary because we aren't brought up to really think about or talk about how faith in the human experience just goes through transitions. And so I just want to, folks want to write down resources like James Fowler, The Stages of Faith, or Richard Rohr, a good book I've been reading lately called Falling Upward. You'll find that across transitions, changes and development in faith is completely normal and even healthy, and can leave you in a much healthier, stronger place in the long run. But while it's happening, it can feel terrifying for both parties.
Yeah, and to also, I'm thinking of some of the things that talked about when he was being vulnerable about fears. It's like when we talk about stages, sometimes in Mormonism, we're very goal oriented, and it's like, oh, is there a stage? Is there a step? I want to be at the top of it, right? I want to get to the best place. And this is not really like that. This is more like there's lots of different places you can end up. And in fact, I'm a big believer that transitions in faith are happening all the time. Just even in a simplistic kind of believer way of talking about that, when you hear somebody say, I went to the temple and I had, kind of an aha moment and looked at something that I've heard maybe 10 or 100 different times that I've heard that same phrase, but I had this aha moment, and now I look at it very differently. That is a faith transition, right? That within the faith structure. So something happened, maybe a lived experience or a different time in your life, where something that was already familiar now has different meaning or has enriched meaning. So these kinds of things are happening to us, whether we stay within the structure or whether it moves us into a nuanced aspect of the structure, or whether it moves us away. And what we want to stay away from is this idea that any of those are better than the other, right? So that staying in is better than leaving, or leaving is more enlightened than staying. We want to really stay away from those types of ways of understanding this, that this is just different perspectives, and that enrichment and moving through those stages can happen in, nuance, or out. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yep.
All right. So another thing that we love to do as humans is we love to label and organize. So we love, and part of this is really necessary, because I don't know if any of you have watched 50 First Dates, right? Or something. It's kind of where Drew Barrymore like loses her memory, and every day she has to wake up and kind of, relearn everything. And so if you had to do that every single day, we'd all go kind of a little berserko. So we need to be able to compartmentalize. We need to be able to label. We need to kind of organize data so that we can not have to make 5 bajillion decisions every day, that we can kind of understand where we're at and move forward and focus on new things. So that's a very normal part of being a human. And at the same time, it causes problems, because as we label or organize data, we can become too simplistic. We can sweep with wide brushes. We can stereotype or, have biases that then kind of pit us in, in what we call maybe othering, like this is the way that I'm going to perceptualize you. And unfortunately, we've done this with a lot of the terms that we use to label our experiences within the church. So even the words active and inactive, those are 2 terms that help us organize a lot of information. We assume a lot of information just if somebody says, they're an active family or they're an inactive family, or you're a believer or a non-believer, or you're, apostate or brainwashed, right? These can be very provocative. And even when they're not necessarily provocative words, they can come with a lot of baggage. And so it's helpful for you to just be aware that we do this, and that especially in a mixed faith relationship, that this is going to potentially have a lot of minefields that we want to at least be aware of and learn how to deal with. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I just want to normalize that we do this, and part of it is okay, and part of it isn't. So this goes right into tribal dynamics, right? And so because we label, and because we are pack animals, we are tribal, we're like wolf families, right? We can't survive on our own, and we can't survive on our own for a really long time, right? Like for 20 years. So we form tribes, and we've been tribal really since the beginning of anything that we can know about humans. There's a lot of wonderful things about tribes. We are safer in numbers. There's a lot of support, resource sharing, accountability, service opportunities. You want to talk about this a little bit too, John, because this is a slide we use a lot together. Okay, some of the cons.
Yeah. If you think back just to the formation of our, civilizations, we kind of had to go into bands. If you even think about gorillas and monkeys, they can only sort of cohesively survive up to a certain number, like let's just say 90 in a group. And so it's just unavoidable biologically for us to kind of have this tendency to have us-them mentalities, to follow the group, to kind of bring that bias, that confirmation bias into what we do, to favor things that conform with the group that we're in. We have that tendency to grasp information that confirms our membership in the group, and to avoid information that conflicts with the group, because there's safety in the group. And it's just normal in a group. A group needs to be cohesive, and people that object or cause trouble in the group historically have just been either rejected from the group or killed. And that's just the way groups have worked historically. And so we have this really interesting dynamic of needing to be tribal animals, of having benefits from this. It's kind of what's helped us advance as civilizations. We get support, we share resources, we're held accountable, all those good things, as long as you go with the group. But as soon as you start going against the group, causing conflict in the group, you risk, being marginalized or rejected or harmed in some way. And that's particularly difficult because from the believing standpoint, what are you doing? You're evolutionarily going against what brings us safety and comfort. And that believing perspective makes perfect sense. At the same time, it's worth noting, why would anyone ever go against the group? Why would they risk exclusion or just, why would they risk whatever punishments might come with going against the group if they're healthy, smart people, courageous and honest people? Then what that necessarily means is they must have really good reasons in their mind for what they're doing. And so this is a slide that reflects what I said earlier, which is both believers and non-believers are right. Believers are right that there's safety in the group and comfort in the group and good things in the group, raising kids, strengthening the marriage, staying moral, having a community. Those are all good. But the non-believers are also coming from a place of courage and integrity, at least in their own minds and from their own perspective. And so the fact that they would be willing to go against what's most comfortable just shows that that's at least from their perspective, if not objectively, an act of courage and of strength and of honesty and of conviction, because it often comes at such a great cost. What would you add to that, Natasha?
I would just add that I think, remember, this isn't a Mormon story, right? This isn't a Mormon slide. And so I would imagine that, we could all relate to this picture, where the group feels very cohesive, whether you're thinking about a Mormon community that you were once a part of, or maybe even a post-Mormon community now. And these dynamics of othering, we do in post-Mormonism too. So a lot of times, as people go through faith transitions, it's easy to say, well, the Mormons are super, biased and discriminatory and, upsetting. And yet a lot of times we could, people can do that in these new groups as well, where they can be very discriminating towards believers. So this us versus them is a very human dynamic because it creates this kind of sense of intimacy. It's almost like a false intimacy. It's called triangulation. It's like, ooh, we can bond together against this other thing. So we feel more bonded in this particular place because we're against this thing, right, together. So then when you are in a mixed faith relationship and you're kind of, straddling the fence between these types of tribal dynamics, well, yeah, that's really hard, because you're feeling, I think, the pressures of these things in ways where you're not both in the same group anymore. So I'm guessing you could really relate to sometimes the little red ball, right, where you don't feel like you belong, maybe in extended family types of scenarios, or maybe in the new group that your partner is excited to be a part of, or things of that nature. So this can be really, really tough, and I think very good for you to understand that this is much bigger than the two of you. This is how we are wired.
This is the history of human civilization.
Yeah. As it's just a funny little cartoon, like, the flamingo who has 2 feet down and like, what's his deal? So this is a classic triangulation. They're going to bond. These two are going to bond over here and feel very congruent and happy and bonded and intimate because that third person over there is helping us feel more cohesive together. So it's just kind of a funny little cartoon. How do the rest of us respond when we have these tribal dynamics? So, when you think about a Mormon baptism, especially of a convert, of an adult member, and I've been to several of those here in evangelical Wichita where people get baptized into these big churches here. It's a huge celebration, right? We have narratives of, this is amazing, you've seen the light. And again, it doesn't have to be a religious group, right? If you join the political party, if you join the post-Mormon group, it's like, welcome, tell us your story, we love you, right? There's this wonderful celebration. And even in Mormonism, what's so interesting is that when we hear about their stories, the convert stories of how they are being rejected by their people, right? So like when the Catholic converts and they're saying, yeah, my parents disowned me, or they wouldn't come to my baptism, or they won't even come to the temple grounds while we're getting married. We're like, oh, we're so sad, and that's awful that they would respond that way, and we love you and we want you to feel, our love. And yet when we're on the other side of the table, which, here's my little Amish kind of shunning picture. Yeah, we don't respond super well when people say, hey, I want to leave the church, or I want to convert to a different religion, or I no longer want to attend. It's not like we're throwing a party for that. We are upset, and maybe we don't shun to the level of certain religious groups, and we don't kill each other, which is nice because that happens too in certain religious groups. And yet what we hear from transitioners often is that they do feel a sense of kind of less direct shunning, that people treat them differently, that in some cases it can be pretty stark. We've heard stories where people don't want to be around, they'll say, well, we don't want you to be around our children anymore, and this is in family systems. We think you're going to be a bad influence, or we're going to stop. We've had a really robust friendship, and all of a sudden we don't really talk to each other anymore or hang out together anymore. So how we respond as tribes to both the bringing in of new people and the loss of our own is a very interesting dynamic for us to be thinking about. And I'd like to invite both of you in your marriage to think about yourself in these scenarios. Okay, this is another thing that we love to do, which kind of goes with the labeling aspect, is that we come up with a lot of stories. We're organizing information. So if you're, on the one hand, willing to have spiritual experiences in a religious setting, we can see that as brainwashed, or what are some other terms that are typically used for religious folks, like naive, willing to give away their authority, stupid even. I mean, these are things I hear even, again, not just towards Mormons, but towards religious people in general. And then if you have the non-religious people, it's like the apostates. All they want to do is sin. They're less committed. They, don't take life seriously. They're immoral. I mean, we could go on and on as far as the stories we tell about large groups of people with wide brushes as part of how we label, which turns into stereotypes, biases, and discrimination. And I'm guessing you've both felt this way in your marriage. And I'm guessing that these are maybe some of the ways that you even consider your spouse. It's easy to lump your spouse into some of these stereotypes. In a way, our culture has taught you to do that on both ends of the spectrum. Anything you'd say about that?
No, just that this is really hard. And I want to give an extra plug for, I think, believers in this case. One of the, I think, advantages that the doubters or the non-believers have is that they were once believing. And so they can oftentimes have empathy for the believing point of view if they're willing to put their anger or frustration or disenchantment aside. Sometimes I like to say that the bigger burden of compassion and empathy should be on the non-believer because they know what it's like to be a believer. But these concepts are I'm just going to acknowledge it, are very hard for believers. The slide you have before this, it's kind of obvious that from a believing perspective, it's totally awesome to convert other religions to Mormonism because from the Orthodox Mormon perspective, Mormonism is the one true church. And it's totally bad to leave Mormonism because Mormonism is the one true church. And so this idea of trying to be more open-minded about how people join and leave all churches, it's a challenging concept, I think, for believers to get comfortable with. And I just want to make space for that and acknowledge it. You're doing the harder work, those of you who are kind of believers. And again, with this, the next slide of brainwash versus apostate, from a believing perspective, these stakes are very, very large. They're big. There are big things at stake from a believing perspective, including whether or not families will be together in the afterlife, and whether you'll be together as a couple, whether your kids will be with you in the afterlife, not to mention whether your kids will, be nurtured in the faith versus taken away. And so I just want to just acknowledge and congratulate believers for how tough just these simple conversations are, because from the believing mindset, it's not equal, it's not balanced. And even though we're trying to make room for understanding both perspectives, I just want to acknowledge how hard that probably is for many believers.
And this is why I like to present with John, because we can kind of catch each other when we're maybe leaning in one direction or another, because I would also say it can be extremely difficult for the non-believer when the whole system is kind of set up for the church attendance, especially if you're the one that's kind of changing the contract. Oftentimes, you're still going along with a lot of things that you feel like, gosh, if I wasn't in this marriage, I would maybe pull my kids completely out, right? Or I would not have them be influenced by this thing I don't want them influenced by anymore. And so again, even from the non-believer standpoint, even though I do agree that you have the opportunity to have been on both sides of it, it can still feel extremely threatening when the whole system is set up for the believer to continue, as far as the ward community, many times extended family, and you're the only one out here saying, hey, wait a minute, I see things here that I don't want my kids influenced by anymore. So what we're trying to do is create a space where we can have empathy that for both of you in a lot of ways is really a crummy situation. Okay. All right. Anger, that was mentioned in several of your introductions. And, we talk a lot about anger and faith transition work, because it is, an important part of the grief cycle. And going through a faith transition is a grief process. It's a process of loss. It's a loss of identity. It's a loss of belief. It's a loss of tradition. And it's a grief cycle for both of you, right? So even if you're not the one going through a faith transition, you're going through the loss of the shifts and changes that in many ways feel imposed upon you. You didn't ask for this shift and change. And so that can create its own grief cycle. Life isn't going the way we had planned, the way we had originally kind of contracted. So any change, even positive changes, will trigger grief cycle processes, and anger is one of those things. So we want to normalize anger. We want to use anger as information, and we also want to help you not get paralyzed or stuck in a space of anger. So we want it to be a normal part of your process. And we do also want to just kind of address that different cultures deal with anger differently. And I would say that both American and Mormon culture are not very comfortable with anger. So any anger can feel extremely debilitating or kind of destabilizing. And so we want to work with anger in ways that can be productive. And oftentimes what happens with unheard or invalidated anger is that it can grow stronger. So we want to not be super afraid of it. We want to address it. We want to lean into it. We also don't want it to take over. So we can talk about some of that further along.
I'll just add, we want to avoid burning bridges. We want you to lean into your anger, to understand it, to learn from it, to get the energy from it you need to be motivated to make change. There are all sorts of good things about anger, or we would not have evolved to have the emotion. What you really want to avoid, in addition to getting stuck in it, like you said, Natasha, is making decisions or acting in a reactive way that does kind of irreparable damage. And so that's just a really important thing to navigate, because you don't work through the anger unless you lean into it and understand it and sit with it and process it. And at the same time, you don't want to have it take over.
Right.
So it's tricky.
It is tricky because it's often motivational, but like a lot of you said too, there can be a lot of anger that is even at the institution or the upbringing or kind of larger concepts, leaders, information. And yet, who's the person who's living with you where you can process all of that anger? Well, it's your partner. And so all of a sudden your partner's like, wait a minute, I'm not the institution, right? I'm not the organization. I'm not the one who, quote unquote, betrayed you. And yet I'm the one where all of this kind of energy is being kind of placed. So that's a very common complaint we get from the believer, the person in the believing place. So that's, again, normal. We want to normalize that. We want to help you find better ways to deal with that. John, you want to take this one? You're pretty good at explaining this.
Sure. So it's really, really important in this faith journey to understand kind of how our brains are built. And basically our brains evolved from inside out, meaning the innermost parts of the brain are the oldest evolutionarily, and the outer parts of the brain come later in the evolutionary cycle. So what that means is what's inside is kind of always going to take precedence and govern what's on the outside. And if you study the brain structures at all, what you'll understand is that there's this brain stem that goes down your spinal cord, and it goes right into the middle of your brain. And then surrounding that brain stem in the core is a section of the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala has many functions, but two of the main functions of the amygdala are memory and emotion. And the amygdala is sometimes referred to as the monkey brain. It's also referred to as the fight, flight, or freeze system. And it's basically there to allow you to respond to threats, danger. And so we evolved, one of the ways we evolved successfully as a species is that when we hear a rustling in the bush on the savannah, when we hear a door open, our brain can all of a sudden kick into gear very quickly. It'll actually, drain blood from other parts of the brain and increase your breathing and increase your energy. And it can prepare you to either fight a foe or run away, or in some other way to act in a very physical way to an impending threat. And that's what the amygdala does. That's what the fight, flight, or freeze system does. And that's likened unto an elephant. It's very strong and it's very powerful, and it's probably the most powerful part of our brains. There's another part of the brain that evolves later that's called the cerebral frontal cortex. And that part of the brain possesses what they call executive functioning, the rational, the logical part of the brain, the ability to make reasoned, cool, calm, calculated decisions. And it's a really important part of being human. And in this analogy that Jonathan Haidt gives us, who's a prominent, very well-known social psychologist, I think from the University of Virginia, he likens the cerebral frontal cortex, or the rational brain, to the rider on the elephant. And so it's useful to think of your brain as having two main parts, even though it's got lots and lots of parts. The emotional brain, which is represented by the elephant, and the logical brain, which is represented by the rider. And the reason why Jonathan Haidt thinks it's really important, he's got a really good book called The Righteous Mind. And what he helps us understand is that we as humans misunderstand how we arrive at decisions. We often think that we arrive at decisions logically or rationally. But what he tells us is, based on lots of in-depth study, we arrive at our decisions primarily emotionally. And then we use, with this idea of confirmation bias, we use information that we encounter as a way to support or justify the decisions that we arrived at emotionally. Now, this is true for believers, but it's also true for non-believers. It's true for everyone. You'll often find that people who lose their faith, they'll often cite logic or things they read. But if you really dig down, what you realize is a lot of this information, whether it's from the CES letter or a podcast or, the church essays, whatever the source of the information is, what you'll find is that information's been around a long time, whether it's from Von Brody's book that was published in the 1940s, or the Tanner stuff that was in the 60s or 70s, or books that were published in the 80s and 90s. The information's been around a long time in public libraries. And if people wanted to doubt or wanted to disbelieve, they would have. And so what I find for a lot of non-believers or doubters is that there was usually some emotional shift that preceded their willingness or openness to doubt. And, you guys can tell me if I'm wrong or right in that. But on the flip side, belief is usually not a logical position. And the church is very upfront about this. They basically equate feelings with knowledge. And they basically tell you, the way you get a testimony is by praying and being in situations religiously where you can have these strong feelings, which they call the Holy Ghost. And if you feel the Holy Ghost and feel these strong feelings, well, that's knowledge, and that's how you know. And so all I'm trying to say is that believers and non-believers share one thing in common, which is usually their position they arrived at emotionally, and then they're both going to be likely to use whatever information or logic they have to justify their position. And both of you are doing it. And so it's important to just recognize that once you start getting into conflict, neither of you are rational. And once the elephant, your amygdala, starts kicking in, what you'll find is that the elephant always beats the rider. The elephant's always stronger. And so, once you really get upset and you're triggered, you will find that you get dumber. And we'll probably talk about that in subsequent slides. Why don't you go ahead and go to that? Do you want to add anything to this before we go to the next slide?
No, I think, I just want to, kind of mirror what you're saying, which is we're emotional creatures first, and that there's nothing wrong with that. We tend to kind of downplay emotion, like emotion is somehow less worthy, and that logic is better somehow. And so these things are actually very co-mingled. And there's actually some great research out there on people who've had head trauma, and the part of their brain that messes with emotion. If you become too logical, per se, you really lack empathy and compassion, and you have huge issues with your relationships. So emotion is something that, again, in this culture, we tend to downgrade and even kind of put, we equate it with like weakness and being, not strong. So I just want to say that emotion and logic are both partners in making our lives very robust, and we want both of those things. And I want to say too that this is why, to your point, John, we have 500 religions that come out of like one book, right? The Bible. You can, it's not, I think a lot of times, especially the non-believers might say, well, gosh, if you would just listen to this podcast, or if you would just read this book. And the reality is you can take two Mormons who have read Rough Stone Rolling, and one person will say, my goodness, that's the end of my testimony. And one person will say,
it strengthened my testimony.
So same information, very different results. And that's because we interpret that information through our lived experience, through our emotions, through our personalities, all of these things that create a much bigger thing than what we think we're consciously thinking about. And I heard you say this first, but we cannot change someone's mind logically from a decision that they have arrived at emotionally. And I think you heard that from somebody else. I'm not sure who we're quoting, but that's a great statement. Great statement.
Yeah. So honestly, there's usually very little benefit to talking about, logic or truth claims or history or evidence or doctrine or theology with the goal of trying to convert or change the mind of the other person. That's just not how the brains work. If there's going to be any shifts, they're going to happen emotionally, usually first. And that's going to make someone open to information. And there are lots of implications about this in terms of the backfire effect and what makes for a healthy conversation versus a destructive conversation. But I'm guessing we're going to save that for future slides. Is that right, Natasha?
Yeah, I think so. And we want to just really kind of at this point, I would just say, whether it's the Ensign articles or whether it's the podcast, just stop. Just stop pushing that kind of material down each other's throats, because first of all, it's probably not going to have the effect that you were hoping it would have. And then there's one more thing that you're fighting about. And secondly, it's not really tuning into this empathic approach. And what we're really wanting you to get comfortable with is this idea, which is actually very, I think centered in Mormon ideology, that we do have the right to our own personal agency. And I think it was who actually made a comment about that, that even though like he respects her agency, his wife's agency, problem is that it's imposing on his agency, right? And so we have this kind of like battle of each other's agencies. And yet there is something I think very powerful about stepping into the space of my partner has the right to their own spiritual journey. And this, I think, helps, some of that foundation. So we're going to end kind of with some maybe ideas that, I think are grounded again in kind of the Mormon story. And whether you find these literal stories or whether, historically accurate stories, or whether these are more just symbolic stories to you, I think they still have a lot of wonderful potential for meaning and symbolism. When you think about the story of Lehi and, he finds the fruit of the tree, and, what is the fruit? Well, the fruit is the love of God, right? It's kind of what the Book of Mormon talks about. And it's something that's so meaningful and beautiful to him. And then what's the first thing that he wants to do with this very valuable, beautiful thing that he has found? He looks around and he wants to share it with who? Well, the people that most matter to him. So even though we just said, don't share things with each other, we want you to understand that a lot of why your partner is desperately trying to get you to read the materials that they've come across, or why your partner is trying to desperately get you to re-engage with the scriptures, right, or with certain church materials, is because that is what's most precious to them. That's what's most precious to them. And they are desperate to share their perspectives, their meaning, the things that matter most to them with you. And that's actually a great act of love, yet it's causing a lot of distress. And there's kind of like an inherent tragedy in that I just want to sit with and just validate for all of you that I think that's what's happening. Anything you'd share about that?
Yeah, I think you really hit it spot on. And that's what's so hard, is that both are usually operating from a position of love, of a position of conviction, of courage, of truth, and of a desire to share. It almost reminds me of another fruit, which is Adam and Eve, and how when Eve took of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and we'll probably have a slide about that, she wanted to share it.
Go for it. Well, I think that it's so, I don't know if you use the word beautiful or ironic, but the faith transition story in many ways is the story that we start with, right? So yeah, why don't you continue your thoughts about that, John?
Yeah, just that, there are many movies that you're familiar with, hopefully, or some of you are familiar with, that convey this central message. If you think about the movie Smallfoot or The Matrix or The Village or Truman Show or Pleasantville, if any of you have seen any of these movies, they very much have the same idea of people, in some idyllic beginning they don't have full information. It's sort of an artificial environment. And then at some point they become disillusioned, they disobey, they find out that the reality that they thought was true isn't or wasn't, and they lose their innocence, and eventually they get cast out of whatever framework they were in. And that presents to them a lifetime, an introduction to adversity, and what the Mormon temple ceremony refers to, or the Genesis story refers to, as thorns, thistles, and noxious weeds. And all of those stories convey this universal experience that's also laid out in the book of Genesis and in the Mormon temple ceremony with Adam and Eve. And I think one of the reasons I like to show this story is just to show how universal this journey is, because it'd be very easy to look at the temple ceremony or the Genesis story as a narrative around a maturing, either a crisis of faith or a maturing of faith or a loss of faith. And I'm guessing that you guys haven't ever thought of it that way, or at least maybe the believers haven't, or maybe you have. But it's a really powerful story when you realize that the Adam and Eve story in the Garden of Eden, including a tree of knowledge of good and evil that's forbidden, and yet when they partake of it, their eyes are opened, which ironically in Mormonism, we spin the Adam and Eve story as being a positive thing. And I think the next slide actually reflects that a little bit, that it could be a story of tragedy, but also of a very positive. Why don't you talk about this, Natasha?
Yeah, and I do want to really emphasize how, for me, one of the wonderful things about Mormonism is how this story is so starkly different than the Christian narrative, the typical Christian narrative that I hear in so many other areas of our country. That, again, the idea that wanting to have knowledge, the idea that there was disobedience, not to a bishop or stake president or even within a marriage, but to God, that we honor Eve, in that regard, that was actually part of the plan, that part of the plan was stepping into spaces of authenticity, knowledge, self-authority. There's something very deeply profound that, again, whether you look at this as a literal story or a symbolic story, can really maybe help you both consider your faith transition journey as something that is offering you something that we talk about from the beginning. And I also think it's super beautiful that this is a mixed faith marriage. So Adam doesn't see it the same way. He doesn't feel the need to partake of the knowledge. He is comfortable where he's at. And yet when it came down to the decision that he made, he chose, to follow the spouse. And I don't know that it necessarily means that he followed her in agreeing with her or having the same perspectives that she had, but he chose the relationship over the church, Garden of Eden per se. And I think there's something really powerful in that, to give you, both hope and kind of a role model of how there can be great beauty and great influence. When we think about one of the famous relationship experts, who's John Gottman in our current country, he talks about one of the principles of healthy marriages is this willingness to have your partner influence you. And that relationships that tend to do better than others is having that idea that I'm willing to have my partner influence me. So we do have a lot of, concepts within Mormonism, within your shared kind of history, where this couple role models a deeper understanding of agency, deeper connection with self-authority, self-trust, potential for developing deeper intimacy. Our whole relationship with pain and joy in Mormonism is an interesting one, where we see them kind of dependent on one another and filling holes with new information, ideas, and possibilities, and spinning that in a positive way, that it's not that Eve was horrific or ruined all of mankind or, sinned horrifically. We really don't have that relationship with Eve like other Christian traditions do. So I think that's where we want to end tonight, is in that space of honoring your mixed faith journey as a gift, even though it doesn't always feel that way. And it can feel really, like I said, crummy, and you can feel scared, and you can feel isolated, and you can feel lonely with the person that you love the most. That can be so hard. And at the same time, there is potential here for something very, very profound if you're open to it. At the same time, I think John and I both want to be very careful. Both of us are very much believers that a faith journey in of itself should hopefully not be what brings a marriage to an end. At the same time, we do not, have the expectation that all marriages should stay together or that every marriage should stay. Sometimes a faith transition is kind of the last straw that broke your camel's back. Sometimes there's a lot of other toxic issues happening in your relationship that maybe now a faith transition is bringing to, is forcing you to deal with in a different way. At the same time, we want to infuse you with hope that this is, we've worked with many, many couples where this is actually the beginning of a much deeper, better intimacy that they're able to get to. And many of them years later say, we would not change a thing about this. They're still in a mixed faith relationship. Sometimes people change with their partner, sometimes they don't. Please don't have the expectation that your partner will eventually join you or eventually come back. I think that it really starts with a space of accepting where your partner is, because there's no guarantee about either one of those things happening. We've seen it go all different ways, but where we've seen a lot of similar patterns that we want to make sure you understand are possibilities for you, is that this can actually deepen your intimacy, deepen your relationship together in ways that you would never have been able to think about before. So what are your thoughts about kind of closing thoughts before we give them some homework?
Yeah, I love everything you said. And I just want to say, I like to sometimes say that a faith crisis doesn't always help or hurt a marriage as much as it does reveal a marriage. And so when both of you are on the church plan of providing income, of raising the kids, of serving in the church, of just doing the parent thing, it's just easy to have a decade or two go by, regardless of how well you're getting along or how much you're really aligned or how much you even love each other, because full activity in the church can just keep you both so busy that you never really have time to look at or to strengthen the relationship necessarily. Now, that's not always true for everyone, but it can be true for sure. And so what a faith crisis often does is it kind of brings a relationship to a screeching halt, and it says, okay, wait a minute. Yeah, we can function under this system that can be very prescriptive, but how do we actually like each other? How aligned are our values? How good are our communication skills? If there's nothing to argue about because the church just hands you the truth and you're both going to follow it, then that can make a relationship very simple. But all of a sudden, if you have to negotiate differences and fundamental differences and manage heavy emotions, a relationship that can seem decent or fine can all of a sudden start feeling very chaotic and even toxic. And so in that sense, sometimes the faith crisis doesn't necessarily harm a marriage, but it just reveals it. And it forces you to look at it and say, oh my gosh, would I have married this person under this other scenario? And do I really love them? And do we really belong together? And oftentimes there's just the midlife crisis. Oftentimes these faith crises hit during the 7 or the 14 year or the 21 year kind of itch, as they call it, because marriages at some point oftentimes lose their excitement. They lose their appeal. They lose their mojo. And so oftentimes religion becomes the football, but the actual conflict is more around just a deterioration of the marriage. And religion is just the field that the game's played on, but it's not actually the core issue. It's actually the relationship. And so I think it's worth, each of you as couples looking at, to what extent is religion really the problem? And to what extent is religion actually a distraction or a convenient avoidance of the actual core problems, which is inability to communicate, different values, interests, traumas, things about your past that haven't been resolved? Because oftentimes religion gets blamed, or religious differences get blamed for actual problems that run much deeper and actually have nothing to do at all. But I also just want to reflect a sense of hope. I can tell you in my marriage with Margie, we absolutely got to the point where at different points, both of us thought the marriage wasn't worth saving. Both of us thought the marriage was hurting the kids more than it was helping them. Both of us were ready to give up. And thank goodness we did some work and found some coaching and some therapists and read some good books, and were able to restore a marriage that we both thought was lost. And we've had now, I can say, 7 years of a very strong, healthy, happy marriage after we were both ready to give up. So in your biggest moments of despair, if there's enough to save and if there's enough worth saving, I want to give you all the encouragement that it can be strengthened and saved. And at the same time, agree with you, Natasha, that not all marriages should be saved. Sometimes there's just too many differences, too much damage, where you're both going to be better off, and the kids are going to be better off if you kind of lovingly find a way to lovingly part and co-parent in separate homes. So it's complicated, but we definitely want you to have hope that you can find joy and healing either together or separately. And our commitment is to help you find that joy and health and healing, preferably with the marriage sticking together. But if not, then we'll help you either way.
Yeah, and a lot of these principles can help with amicable divorce as well. And, when it comes to the kids, you're going to have to co-parent regardless of what you do with your marriage. So you're going to have to figure that out anyway. So hopefully some of our, ideas around parenting in the third section will be helpful to you in that regard. Okay, so just to recap, tonight was really about framework. We wanted to frame some basic ideas, normalize your experience, help you understand a lot of what's happening isn't necessarily just unique to Mormonism or just happening in a Mormon kind of landscape, even though there are unique aspects to Mormonism. I mean, Mormonism tends to be a more involved religion, so there's a lot more markers, a lot of lifestyle issues. If you're a very devout Catholic, you're spending probably less time at church than if you're a very devout Mormon, right? So it's just kind of one of those things. So it can feel a little bit more intense. And yet we think it's important for you to understand frameworks that are bigger than Mormonism so that you really understand how you're negotiating your faith transition and the things that worry you, where they're coming from. All right, so some thoughts that we have about homework. And we're going to just quickly explain some of these. You can use them or not. But I think that a values exercise is very helpful. This is very simple to do. Both of you take some individual time and write down everything that you value, everything that whether it's spiritual and religious, like I value a relationship with God, or I value my testimony in the Mormon church. It can be things that feel religious, but that aren't really owned by Mormonism, like I value honesty, or I value being, the golden rule, right? Things like that. It can be secular things, like I value the environment and recycling. I value education. Think about all the things, your quote unquote testimony per se of things that you really believe or feel are important. And then come together and compare your lists, okay? And what we really find helpful about this exercise is that there will probably be about 10 to maybe 15% on that list that maybe are different. And most of those things might be Mormon-esque type things. And yet you'll find usually a lot of other things that you still very much are on the same page on. When John was talking about how we tend to notice difference and we notice difficulty because we're wired to defend ourselves, what we want to remind you about is that in the field of yellow tulips, where your faith transition is the one red tulip in the middle, and it's causing most of your focus to go there, you still have a field of yellow tulips and you still have a lot in common at a time when you feel like maybe you don't. So we want to really have you hone into that. And that can be the foundation for a lot of things, how you talk to your kids, family home evenings, the topics you decide to work on or have similar interests in. That can be a really great kind of re-foundational exercise where some of the columns maybe are no longer there, where you have similar beliefs, but in general, you still probably do have a lot of similar values and beliefs. Another homework exercise is a repair exercise, kind of with this blank slate intent. So at the beginning, again, probably most of you can think of something that you feel you've kind of maybe done incorrectly in this faith transition. Maybe you have projected a lot of anger onto your partner. Maybe you've done a lot of missionary DNA type stuff on your partner. Maybe you've name called, your partner different things. Maybe you've made unilateral decisions without including your partner. There's lots of things that maybe we've done that we wish we could rework. So maybe come up with some type of repair exercise where you can do some type of ritual. Maybe it's an apology where you talk about, these are some things I'd like to take responsibility for. These are some things I think maybe I've been hurtful on. Just focus on your own stuff that you want to take responsibility. And then maybe create a ritual, maybe go on a walk or burn a letter or do something that kind of creates a space of, we want to at least, as best as we can, have a blank slate intent and, let bygones be bygones. And we're going to really move here forward, trying to do better. You're not going to do better perfectly, but just at least that intent. I'd like for you to really have a commitment to stop using provocative language and start using the for me strategy. So be cognizant. That's something you can kind of just keep in your mind as you go through day to day. And timeout strategies, I think, are really important. So anytime that you're arguing longer than, I would say, 15 or 20 minutes, that intellect thing that John talked about, you are now in stupid mode. You're stupid, you're mad, you're defensive, you're not listening, you're like two ships crossing in the sea, and you need to take a break. Now, the problem with this is that one of you is probably wired to really like breaks. So one of you is like, I'm out of here. And the other one of you is probably the pursuer, like, oh, no, you don't, you get back in here, you keep talking to me. And so I'm guessing the withdrawer is going to be better at the timeout strategy than the pursuer. But the trick is that whoever calls the timeout has to commit to coming back to the table. And a timeout really shouldn't be longer than, I would say, 20 minutes to like 2 days. That should be your time frame. Hopefully it's more in the 20 minutes to a few hours, but sometimes, these things are happening like at 1 o'clock in the morning and you just need to go to bed, or things come up with the kids. And so maybe a day goes by and you haven't had a chance to revisit it, but you try to come back to the table. And if you can't come back to the table, even in those 2 days, you let your partner know that you're still remembering that you're planning to come back to the table. Because it can be extremely anxiety producing for a pursuer to have somebody just say, we're not talking about this anymore. But it can also be really harmful for you to continue to engage in that defensive kind of mess where you're just continuing to harm each other. So practice good timeout strategies. Anything you'd add to explaining any of those things, John, better than I just did?
No, that's great homework. I know that it will bear positive fruit if people do it. So if they need to print this stuff out or write it down, just following these 4 bullets can make it well beyond worth what you paid for this session. Margie and I use these all the time, especially the timeouts.
Yeah, great. So I am okay with, I know we're going over a little bit, but I'm okay with turning the video back on and just maybe spending 15 minutes with the discussion. Are you okay with that time-wise, John, or?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, are y'all still with us? Who's fallen asleep? Who's still around? And yeah, just open it up to questions, comments, feedback. What was something that was really helpful? What do you have a question on?
The rules. We said the Holy Ghost goes to bed after midnight.
That's right. That's right. There's a lot of truth to that one. Any burning questions, first of all?
I had a really profound, I said that I'm atheist agnostic, but I had a really profound reaction to the Eve story, sort of that relation that you made there. And I don't, have a belief in sort of the faith aspect of that, but sort of honoring that, just that connection to the stories that we've been told, and also that she just kind of had the bullet points that you put out, that accepting the agency. I can't remember. I was going to write them down. I don't know if you can go back to that, but
yeah. And it sounds like you had just kind of like a different perspective kind of open up for you.
Yeah. And so filling the holes in. So yeah, I was just like, that is just like, I'm Eve. That's totally like, that is me. And I appreciate that last slide. Cause sorry.
That framing.
I want to go back and listen to everything that you said, because I was just totally zoned into everything you said. I was like, I just felt like it just hit me totally in my heart, because I don't know.
Good. I'm so glad to hear it. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that was an insightful thing for you. Great. Anybody else?
Yeah, I wanted to say one of the things that I've tried to use logic. I've stopped. Bad idea.
It hasn't worked for you? Is that what you're saying?
It hasn't worked at all. And I'm not using anything at this point, but I thought that was very fascinating, just to learn that we all come to these things that we have emotional, we arrive at things emotionally. And it was interesting for me to be real about how I came to where I'm at and what the thoughts and feelings were that got me here. And I was like, oh yeah, wow. It totally was emotional. And that emotional rabbit hole led me to something else and something else and something else. And there's a lot of emotionality and there's a lot of logic that comes after that emotionality to back it up, that confirmation bias. But interesting, fascinating, actually.
Awesome. Good. Anyone else?
It's hard.
It is. And, John usually says too that it's a good practice for everybody to just go around and say one thing that you commit to trying, this maybe next week or in the next few weeks. Because when we commit in a group setting, we're more apt to follow through. So maybe we'll do that quickly, like a roundabout. Some of you kind of maybe already mentioned that, but why don't we start with Dory and Jonathan since they're at the top of how I'm seeing them.
I'm excited to do the value exercise.
Great.
I don't know. I'm the runner, so probably the timeout strategy would be the best one for me.
Okay. So you're good at the timing out part, and then you're going to have to come back to the table.
I'm an expert timeouter.
Awesome.
Very good.
I know, but she has to come back. If not, you come and tattletale on her. Okay. All right.
Can I say something really quick before we move away from us?
Yes.
I thought this was quite cathartic, just simply to see other couples and what they're going through and some of the dumb stuff they've done too. Kind of made me feel good about
We've
my
run the
own dumb
gamut.
stuff. And I don't know, it just kind of became real because this is way hard.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Danielle and Elijah.
Go ahead, I'll talk a lot.
I don't know. I'm going to have to go back over it. I feel like we do a lot of these things already. We come to them naturally. But the value exercise and some of the provocative language, I think, is what we still have to work on.
Okay, great.
The value exercise and the repair exercise for sure. We've had a lot of resentment that's built up over the years, and just lots of hurt.
Okay,
Sort
great.
of.
Thank you.
It's kind of starting fresh with a lot of things. So I think that'll be kind of cathartic.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, you've all been wonderful. And I'll end with this question, so having you all on this adds a huge amount. Like you said, it's nice to see other people talking. It's nice to see other people's mistakes.
I just wanted to share one of my ahas. I did not realize the whole grieving, like I've heard about the grieving cycle before. I've read about it. I've studied it, all sorts of things. But I've never caught that change. You really have to go through the grieving cycle when you're changing. And so even if it's a positive one. So my thought is even like in tying it back to this, why are you laughing?
Because the runner is a changer too.
Yes, I love change.
So
I
I'm
embrace
constantly grieving. It's not that funny.
But I'm just thinking like, I'm okay with like, if something I said was not quite how I wanted it, I can just grieve this moment.
Grieve your imperfection.
Yeah. And just, start with a clean slate next time.
Right. That's a great self-acceptance approach, right? Grace.
That was my thought.
Lovely. That's lovely. All right, everybody, good night. I know it's late. We'll see you next Tuesday night.
Yeah.
We'll
Hang in there,
talk
guys.
to you soon. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Well.